not about the details of their ongoing investigation, but with Michigan State Police leadership, who consistently assure us that the timeliness and fairness of the investigation is a top priority of their department, and who have complimented the Grand Rapids Police Department on our cooperation in response to their numerous requests for information. While I was conducting a review of our department during my first 90 days to ensure best practices in training and policy, the investigation into this tragic event will likely inform many decisions moving forward. Topics such as ensuring the sanctity of life is the top priority of Grand Rapids police officers, ensuring only the minimum force necessary is used for law enforcement purposes, and the traffic enforcement is public safety focused, are early issues I anticipate focusing on. Ensuring officers in the Grand Rapids Police Department are receiving the best training on use of force, de-escalation, crisis intervention, and cultural competency are also a priority. A city is entitled to be policed in a manner embraced by the city, and to have its officers educated and trained on things which the city deems important. I recognize the gravity of this time for policing in Grand Rapids, and I'm confident in our ability to move forward in the right direction as an organization. I look forward to returning in the coming months to this body to update on the improvements we're making in policing and police-community relations.
Very good. Thank you, Chief. We'll now have the update from the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability and the Office of Equity and Engagement, and after that we'll open things up for Q&A for colleagues here on the dais. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good afternoon to you all. As our community continues to process the trauma and vicarious trauma experience due to the incident involving the loss of life, particularly of Mr. Loyola's life, we are being extremely intentional while working to seek justice and transparency and accountability by fulfilling our roles in the investigatory process. We're also working to prepare for a post-incident review of this investigation and engaging with our community with an emphasis on our immigrant and refugee communities. So we'll talk a little bit about those three main areas throughout this update. But before you'll see this graphic that has been prepared to help community better understand the roles and responsibilities of the multiple entities that are involved in this investigation. Pursuant to Administrative Policy 1502, the investigation of any GRPD officer involved shooting is reviewed or investigated by the Michigan State Police for potential criminal acts. This policy governs an incident when a GRPD officer shoots at someone or is shot at in the line of duty. Now, the roles and responsibilities are depicted in this graphic that are before you, but those roles for the Michigan State Police include performing an independent investigation of the officer-involved shooting, and that did begin on April 4th. MSP responded to the scene and began that investigatory process. Now, the purpose of this is to have a third party, is to promote fairness and remove perceived or actual conflicts of interest. Additionally, it's important to point out that the city has no authority over the investigation, including the timeline of the investigation. So we have no way to influence that timeline. Generally, the investigation includes the interview of witnesses, collection of evidence, which will include medical examiner reports, photographs, videos, or ballistics, and a thorough review of evidence. After that investigation is complete, then the investigative report or the police reports in that case are referred to the prosecuting attorney and also to the Grand Rapids Police Department. It's important to note that does not always happen simultaneously. The reports may go to the prosecuting attorney first, because the prosecuting attorney will have the ability to seek additional investigation if they find it to be necessary. But at some point, those reports will go to both the prosecuting attorney and to the Grand Rapids Police Department. So if we turn to the role of the prosecutor in this space, the prosecutor receives the reports and evidence, and then they review those reports. And again, they can request or conduct additional investigation if they find that necessary. But ultimately, it is the prosecuting authority that determines whether criminal charges will be issued in a particular case. They're not subject to any specific timelines or deadlines under the law. Again, the city has no way to influence whether or not charges are issued in a particular case. In fact, it will be improper for us to make requests in that space. So this is the space that there is independent prosecutorial discretion about whether or not to issue charges. The next space is to really talk about our city function. So you'll see boxes for the Grand Rapids Police Department as well as for the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. So similarly, GRPD receives the reports of the Michigan State Police and they complete the employment investigation. Now, the Kent County prosecutor, again, is looking at any criminal charges, but the employment investigation occurs at the GRPD or in the city space. Now, the police will rely heavily on the police reports that are provided by the Michigan State Police in order to conduct that investigation. But if they find it necessary, they may seek additional information and additional investigation. Ultimately, it will be determined whether the city or GRPD's rules, procedures, and or policies were violated. That is the basis for which an employment investigation is handled. The Internal Affairs Division will move as quickly as possible to make an employment decision. The Office of Oversight and Public Accountability receives and reviews all available evidence, including reports from the Michigan State Police to the extent allowed by law, and further receives periodic updates from the police department during their internal affairs investigation. We'll evaluate the findings in the internal affairs report, and we'll conduct a full audit post the investigation done by Internal Affairs, which means we'll look at everything and make determinations to see if it followed policies and procedures in the law. We'll release audit findings publicly. They'll be redacted to the extent required by law, but we'll do that as quickly as possible. So that takes us through the overall summary of the roles and responsibilities for each agency involved in the investigation of an officer-involved shooting. But in addition to the actual investigation of an officer-involved shooting, we know that there are a lot of other questions that have come up related to policy that must be considered, and they will be considered as part of a post-investigative review that will happen. Questions that have been raised are how much time it took to release the video of this incident. We know those are questions that need to be considered. When should an officer's name be released in connection with an investigation? The amount of time it took to render aid. What policy changes, if any, can be implemented to help prevent this type of result. Policies that deal with the sanctity of life and cultural competency, and then questions around when should officers use disengagement as a form of de-escalation. I'm committed to thoroughly reviewing these matters post-investigation and any other questions that might arise throughout the course of the investigation. However, right now we understand that the most important thing for us to do is focus on the actual investigation of the officer-involved shooting. So that is the primary focus at this time, but we will continue to do the post-investigation and its matter to ensure that there is truth and accountability. In addition to the investigation and the post-incident review, OPA has been working with the Office of Equity and Engagement, as well as the Police Department and the Executive Office to increase engagement regarding our public safety matters. We're very grateful for our faith-based leaders who have come to the table and been of great support throughout this process, as well as for leaders that we're building relationships with in our African immigrant and refugee communities. Throughout our conversations and engagement with our African refugee and immigrant communities, several things have come to the table related to needs in the public safety space. One of the things that came up that was there was specific emphasis given to was Know Your Rights programming. And some of you may know that the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability does offer Know Your Rights programming citywide, but there are specific needs for our African immigrant and refugee communities that were raised. Of particular emphasis are questions regarding the difference between laws in the countries of origin and here in the United States, or different cultural expectations, or the way in which one interacts with police, or things of that nature that are different from one country to another. So we are currently working to modify our curriculum, and we're working in partnership with community and other agencies to offer similar training to make sure we can roll out something that works well for our African immigrant and refugee communities. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Ms. Stout, who will further discuss our engagement efforts. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Just want to continue to send my condolences to Mr. Loyola, his family, and loved ones, and all those, so many that are impacted by this tragic and horrific death. Our most recent efforts to reach out, I was specifically asked to talk about our outreach efforts to the immigrant community with an emphasis on the African immigrant and refugee community. So our most recent efforts to reach out to the African immigrant community, and really all immigrant communities, are rooted in our participation in the Welcome Plan for Kent County. The Welcome Plan is a result of National Gateways for Growth Strategic Planning Award, helping local communities such as ours to develop multi-sector plans to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment for immigrant and refugees, both through policy and programs. Our planning process was led by a steering committee with representatives from the City of Grand Rapids Area Chamber of Commerce, West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Kent County, and Samaritas, which many of you know is a local refugee resettlement organization, along with a task force of 36 organizations from across the community. Participatory in design and implementation, the Welcome Plan reflects the voice of new Americans and provides a measurable framework for our community to work on. Immigrant Voice is the foundation for the Welcome Plan and is based on over 800 surveys and over 25 focus groups with our diverse immigrant community representing 33 different countries. It is from those surveys and conversations that the Welcome Plan recommendations emerge. It is important to note, not one entity is responsible for carrying out the entire plan. Rather, it requires all of us in all sectors to find our place in the plan and collaborate to carry it out. The Welcome Plan, which I can send to you, was released in September 2020 and provides recommendations in 5 categories: civic engagement, economic development, safe and connected communities, education, and equitable access to services. It was also at this time that the Welcome Plan coordinator transitioned out of her role to attend law school. Kent County is a fiduciary of this effort and is in the process of hiring a new coordinator with guidance from the steering committee. In the interim, the City of Grand Rapids has done the following, specifically related to Welcome Plan recommendations. We've drafted and piloted a new language access policy that is expected to be implemented in the next fiscal year across our organization. We launched a series, Welcoming GR, to offer city staff opportunities throughout the year on topics related to the Welcome Plan and to connect to the local immigrant community. We widened sponsorship and support to immigrant-led celebrations such as A Glimpse of Africa, Hispanic Festival, Fiesta Mexicana, and others. Awarded neighborhood match fund contracts for projects with a focus on immigrant community along with additional communities in Grand Rapids. Intentional to reach out to immigrant-owned businesses to register them as a city vendor and receive micro-local business enterprise certification. We changed process to provide people the option to file complaints about public safety and the police with the Office of Oversight and Accountability instead of directly at the police station. And as Mr. Davis said, we offer Know Your Rights training to youth, this example specifically in the Drive for Success program at the Boys and Girls Club. In recent weeks, the city has reached out and met with Welcome Plan collaborator from the African Collaborative Network to ask them what support is needed at this time. Based on that conversation, we are working on a contract with the African Collaborative Network to provide training to city staff via the Welcoming Series and to strengthen existing police training and policy for long-term systemic change. The ACN is very interested in policy change and advocacy work, and we applaud the work that they've been doing. The city has also reached out to A Glimpse of Africa leadership and will be supporting their upcoming 2-day wellness and mental health event on May 13th and 14th, geared toward local African immigrants and refugees. This 2-day event was being planned prior to April 4th. And we will also support monthly events and spaces for the community to gather over the next year, per their request. In addition, select city staff and officials were invited to attend the initial gathering on May 1st to listen, to deeply listen, and engage with the local African immigrant refugee community. This is a Glimpse of Africa event, so I can't speak for the organizers. However, it is my understanding at this time that this is for the African community and those specifically invited by A Glimpse of Africa. And a very small, recent step, so very small, Step to include is to engage and be in community is the city's support of the upcoming Refugee World Cup. Part of engagement sometimes is just being with people, being in community, building those relationships. I will be there personally. Through this series of initial meetings, additional needs were identified, such as immigration legal support, education on knowing one's immigration and legal rights during encounters with law enforcement. And then, of course, the city's OPA is adapting the Know Your Rights curriculum to meet this need specifically for different cultural communities, which is important. Thank you, Mr. Davis. While the Office of Equity Engagement, in partnership with the Welcome Plan Steering Committee, is mapping out what legal supports are out there right now and see where we can help leverage our influence per our equity value to fill in gaps. Since the incident, several meetings have occurred with members of the African and Congolese community to include Congolese faith and community leaders. The city is listening and working with these community leaders to plan future engagement with the Congolese community to follow up on concerns, better understand culture so we can be responsive, and identify opportunities to partner and support. Earlier today, I was asked about data specific to Grand Rapids and the African community. We're looking that up. It's hard to get it specifically within our boundaries of the city, but we are working on data maybe at the broader sense. A lot of our immigrant and refugee community also live in Kentwood as well. And then it's also important, there's many cultures within the African immigrant community. So that's what we're doing as of now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stout. I'd like to open things up now to my colleagues here on the committee. Would like to see if you have any questions for any of the three who just provided an update. If so, please. I'll start with my colleague, Pastor Moody, or Commissioner Moody.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. I appreciate this. To the Chief and Brandon, Mr. Davis, and Mr. Stout, we heard most of this information this morning. I want to thank you for continuing to elaborate on it. I appreciate your transparency in terms of how you get information out to us as well as this community. And I really appreciate the fact that you're going to be really working with the African immigrant community and other immigrants as well, so that it brings a better perspective as to what rules and regulations that they are looking to learn from in our city as well. I think that's so key and so important to our community. And I just want to say thank you guys for what you're doing. It's difficult for all of us. Our hearts go out to what is taking place in our city, but at the same time, I still believe that we still have some work to do.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Connor, anything? No? Okay. Colleagues? Anyone? Yep. Mr. Lim?
Thank you, Commissioner. My first question is to Chief Winstrom. Now that Officer Scher's name's been released to the public, just curious what protections are being afforded to Officer Scher under the GRPOA bargaining agreement, or if there's been any contact from the GRPD by the police union at this point?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Lim. I'm not exactly sure what you mean about protections.
Just curious what the conversation has been between the department and the GRPOA, assuming that Officer Scher has union representation at this time.
Just as I embrace transparency with this body, with the commission, with members of the community, I also embrace transparency within the police department. And I've been in contact with Officer Scher the day of the shooting. I met with him and his wife several days after. I've talked to him several times since. So I've had that conversation. He is entitled to union representation. He's also entitled to an attorney. As far as specifics related to employment or any sort of legal action, that's not something that I'm involved in at this time, as the investigation is still ongoing.
Thank you. My other question is for Mr. Davis. Just curious if the city has been engaged in any conversations with the police union at this point, either anticipating any kind of legal actions or anything has been initiated.
So nothing has been initiated at this point. The officer, like any other officer in the Grand Rapids Police Department, is entitled to union representation as a union member, but we're not at that part of the process, right? So the investigation is still happening now. So because the investigation is still happening, there's been no findings as it relates to anything, or no appeals or anything like that being filed at this point.
Thank you. This one, the final question is for the commissioners. Any comments on having Chris Becker need to recuse himself, given his office's history with the GRPD? Has there been any moves by our commissioners to call for the Attorney General to step in and take over the investigation, or has there been any movement from city leadership to remove Chris Becker as the main prosecuting attorney?
If I'll turn it over to Madam Attorney.
So we've strongly advised that our commissioners do not get involved because we need the process to be fair and impartial, and they can't be seen as putting influence on that. And so we've advised them of that. As far as Chris Becker recusing himself, he has the authority to recuse himself if he deems that there's some conflict of interest. We don't have any control over that. If he chooses to, then certainly the Attorney General can step in, but if he chooses not to, then he is the Chief Enforcement Officer of the County of Kent. And so we have no influence over that. When it comes to MSP or the prosecutor's office, meaning the investigation or the prosecution, the City of Grand Rapids has no influence over that.
And is there a reason, Ms. Hitchcock, why we are advising city leaders not to remain arbitrary in this process, to allow the process to play out?
Yeah, because we want, the investigation isn't done. We want all parties to get a fair and just treatment in the process. And so it would not be advisable for them or anyone from the city of Grand Rapids to exhibit those influences.
Despite the fact that we know for a fact that there's been collusion between the Kent County Prosecutor's Office and GRPD in the past?
Well, we don't know that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. Any others? Questions, comments? No? Okay. Seeing none, I'll go ahead and adjourn the Public Safety Committee meeting. Thank you.